A wooden gate, a key that wouldn't work, a 911 call. Sounds like the setup to a bad sketch comedy, right? That's what I thought too, until I realized the woman at my gate, Bethany Higgins, wasn't just overstepping. She was about to drag me into a neighborhood nightmare. I was mid-sip of my morning coffee when she marched up with her so-called master key like she was the queen of the cul-de-sac. Thought it was going to be one of those weird HOA spats. Turns out, it was the first crack in something way bigger. While you're here, drop a comment. Who's the Bethany where you live? This is QA Stories, and you're going to want to see where this goes. Let me back up and paint you the picture. My name's Dawson Merritt, and I'm a landscape architect living in what I thought was a quiet lakeside community outside Portland. I'd just finished installing this beautiful wooden gate at the entrance to my driveway. The gate sat exactly on my property line, built from cedar and iron I'd designed myself. It sat right where it was supposed to be, according to the survey I'd had done when I bought the place 3 years earlier. I wasn't trying to make any kind of statement with it. I just wanted some privacy, and maybe to keep the occasional deer from wandering into my garden. That Tuesday morning, I was sitting on my front porch with my coffee when I heard this sound that can only be described as, well, imagine someone trying to kick down a door with their fists. Bang, bang, bang echoed through the peaceful morning air, and I nearly spilled my coffee all over myself. I looked toward my gate and saw this woman in a bright red blazer marching up my driveway like she owned the place. Bethany Higgins, our HOA president, was about 5'4", with perfectly styled blonde hair and the kind of expression that suggested she'd been personally offended by the existence of my gate. The woman had this way of moving that screamed, "I'm in charge here." "This hideous gate violates our community aesthetic standards," she announced before she was even within normal speaking distance. "It has to go." I'm not even sure why I was so caught off guard by her volume. I'd been to enough HOA meetings to know that Bethany didn't believe in indoor voices. Looking back, I should have seen that as a red flag about what kind of person I was dealing with, but at the time, I was just confused about why someone would be so worked up about a simple wooden gate on my own property. I stood up, still holding my coffee mug, and tried to keep my voice calm and reasonable. "Good morning, Bethany. The gate's been approved by the county and it's entirely on my property. I've got all the permits if you'd like to see them." But she wasn't interested in permits or property lines or any of that boring legal stuff. Instead, she dramatically pulled out this brass key from her blazer pocket and held it up like she was about to perform some kind of magic trick. The key caught the morning sunlight and seemed to gleam with an almost supernatural confidence. I actually wondered for a moment if she thought she was some kind of medieval lord with the right to enter any property in her domain. "My key opens every proper gate in this community," she declared, repeating what I'd heard her say at least a dozen times during HOA meetings. "The HOA doesn't accept closed doors." The way she said it made it sound like some kind of sacred principle, rather than just regular HOA business. Looking back now, I should have known that this whole thing was about more than just aesthetic standards, but at the time, I was just confused about why she thought her key would work on my lock. The whole concept seemed completely backwards to me. Bethany marched up to my gate with complete confidence, inserted her master key, and nothing. The key didn't turn. She tried again, pushing harder this time, and I could see her face starting to change color. The third attempt involved some vigorous jiggling and what sounded like muttered curse words under her breath. By the fourth try, her perfectly composed HOA president facade was cracking, and her face had gone from its normal pale complexion to an alarming shade of red. "This lock is illegal," she finally shouted, yanking the key out so hard I thought she might break it. "You've tampered with HOA property." That's when I realized we weren't just dealing with a simple misunderstanding about property boundaries. Bethany genuinely believed that her key should open my gate, which meant she thought my gate was somehow her property. The entitlement was breathtaking. Here was someone who actually expected to have access to my private driveway just because she held some volunteer position in our neighborhood association. I wasn't sure if I should laugh or call someone for help because this level of delusion seemed like it might require professional intervention. "Bethany," I said, trying to keep the situation from escalating further, "this is my private property. The gate is on my land, installed with proper permits, and you don't have any legal authority to enter without my permission." I wasn't trying to be confrontational, I was just stating facts, but apparently facts weren't what Bethany wanted to hear. She stepped back from the gate and pointed at me with a finger that was shaking with rage. "You have exactly 24 hours to remove this obstruction," she announced. "If it's still here tomorrow, you'll be facing massive fines, legal action, and I will make your life a living hell until you comply with community standards." The way she said living hell made it clear that she wasn't speaking hypothetically. This was a woman who had clearly made good on similar threats before. I could see the calculation in her eyes. She was already planning her next moves, already thinking about how to make me suffer for daring to question her authority. It was genuinely unsettling to realize that I was dealing with someone who took personal offense at being told no. That evening, after Bethany had stormed off to terrorize some other poor soul in the neighborhood, I sat down with all my HOA paperwork to double-check everything. I'm pretty meticulous about this kind of stuff. Comes with the territory when you're designing landscapes and dealing with property regulations for a living. But as I was going through the documents I'd signed when I bought the house, I found this clause that I definitely didn't remember agreeing to. It was buried on page 7 of an 8-page addendum written in the kind of legal language that makes your eyes glaze over. But it basically said that the HOA had inspection rights for any structure that might impact community safety or property values. The whole thing felt suspicious, like someone had slipped it in there hoping nobody would notice. I stared at that paragraph for a good 10 minutes, trying to remember signing anything like that. I never signed anything like this. Either someone forged my signature or I signed it while sleepwalking with my left hand. The whole thing felt wrong. But I couldn't prove anything, and I definitely couldn't afford to hire a lawyer to fight it. What really bothered me was the timing. This mysterious clause seemed perfectly designed to give Bethany exactly the authority she needed to harass me about my gate. That couldn't be a coincidence, could it? I was starting to wonder if there were other homeowners who had similar surprise clauses in their paperwork, and whether anyone else had questioned them. I had no idea the gate was just the beginning. The next few days turned my peaceful morning coffee routine into an exercise in anxiety management. Every time I walked to my mailbox, I found another official-looking violation notice waiting for me. First it was obstructing lake views, then noise pollution, then disrupting community feng shui, each more absurd than the last. I wish I was making that up, but I've still got the paperwork to prove it. The violations were getting more ridiculous by the day, but they all had official letterhead and Bethany's signature, so they looked legitimate enough to be intimidating. What really got to me was how systematic the harassment felt. Each violation notice was carefully crafted to sound just plausible enough that someone might take it seriously, but just ridiculous enough that I couldn't believe any reasonable person would enforce it. The violations walked the line between plausible and ridiculous, just enough to wear me down. I started to wonder how many other people in the neighborhood had received similar treatment, and whether anyone had ever successfully challenged these fake violations. The sheer audacity of charging someone $1,000 for feng shui disruption suggested that Bethany had been getting away with this kind of behavior for a long time. Hidden among Friday's pile of fake fines, I found something that made my blood run cold. It was a handwritten note on plain white paper, with no signature or return address. She forced 3 families to sell their homes and move away. It said in careful block letters, "Don't try to play fair with Bethany Higgins." The note felt real. Someone was scared but brave enough to warn me. 3 families? That seemed like a lot for a community of maybe 40 houses. But then again, I'd only lived here for 3 years and I kept pretty much to myself. The implications of that anonymous warning started to sink in over the weekend. If 3 families had really been forced out by HOA harassment, that represented a significant percentage of our small community. I started thinking back to the neighbors I used to see regularly who had seemingly disappeared without explanation. The elderly couple who used to walk their dog past my house every morning. The young family with the vegetable garden that suddenly went untended. I'd assumed these were just normal life changes, people moving for jobs or family reasons, but what if they'd been systematically targeted and pushed out? The thought made me feel sick, both for what those families must have gone through and for my own failure to notice what was happening right under my nose. I decided to fight back the only way I knew how, with facts and proper documentation. I spent the entire weekend researching property law and HOA regulations. My gate was 100% legal. It was on my own land, didn't block any easements or right-of-ways, and violated absolutely 0 actual HOA rules. The community's official bylaws, which I downloaded from the county website, didn't say anything about gates requiring HOA approval. They mentioned fences over 6 feet tall and structures within 10 feet of the street, but my gate was 4 feet tall and sat 20 feet back from the road. I wrote up a detailed, professionally worded response citing specific regulations and property law, and I hand-delivered it to Bethany's house Monday morning. I actually felt pretty good about that response. I'd kept my tone respectful but firm, and I'd backed up every point with legal citations. For a brief moment, I thought maybe this could all be resolved with reason and proper documentation, but Bethany's response came Tuesday morning in a form I wasn't expecting. Instead of a letter or phone call, I woke up to find that she'd posted photos of my gate on the community's online forum with a rant about architectural eyesores that destroy property values and community character, and selfish residents who think rules don't apply to them. The comments section filled up pretty quickly, but most of the responses were just variations of, "Thanks for keeping our community beautiful, Bethany," and "Some people have no respect for their neighbors." I mean, seriously? Did she really say that out loud? I started to wonder if these people were looking at the same gate I'd installed, or if Bethany had somehow convinced them that my perfectly normal wooden gate was some kind of environmental disaster. The whole thing felt surreal, like I was watching a coordinated campaign to gaslight me into believing that up was down and black was white. What really bothered me was how quickly the narrative had shifted from legal property dispute to community villain refuses to cooperate. That's when it hit me. I thought I was arguing about wood and metal construction, but watching how she twisted information and manipulated people, I realized I was actually fighting HOA politics and power games. This wasn't about aesthetics or property values or community standards. This was about control, and Bethany was using every tool in her arsenal to maintain it. The violation notices, the public shaming campaign, the legal threats, it was all designed to make me fold and remove the gate without a fight. Maybe that anonymous note was right about 3 families being forced out. Maybe I was seeing exactly how that process worked. During one of our increasingly heated phone conversations that week, and by heated I mean Bethany did most of the talking while I tried to get a word in, she accidentally let something slip that made my ears perk up. She was going on about legal action and community standards when she mentioned something about a water utility expansion project that needed clear access routes. She caught herself mid-sentence and quickly changed the subject back to my supposed violations, but I could tell she'd said more than she meant to. I started to suspect that my gate might be blocking something much bigger than I'd originally thought. Water utility expansion? Clear access routes? That didn't make sense for a lakeside community that already had well-established infrastructure, unless they were planning something new that required access through my property. I tried to press her for details about this utility project, but Bethany shut down the conversation pretty quickly. "That's HOA business that doesn't concern you," she said, which was a weird response considering I was supposedly a member of this HOA. "Your only concern should be removing that illegal obstruction before we're forced to take more serious action." I wasn't sure I wanted to find out what that meant, but I was starting to get the feeling that I didn't have much choice in the matter. The anonymous warning kept echoing in my head, 3 families forced out. I was starting to wonder if I was about to become victim number 4. Bethany called an emergency HOA meeting for the following Thursday evening, with exactly one item on the agenda, addressing the Merrick Gate violation and community disruption. The notice appeared in everyone's mailbox Tuesday morning, which gave the whole neighborhood exactly 2 days to prepare for what I was pretty sure would be my public execution. I wasn't sure if I was overreacting, but based on everything that had happened so far, I figured this meeting was going to be less about community discussion and more about Bethany putting me in my place in front of all my neighbors. I spent those 2 days trying to decide whether to show up and defend myself or just skip the whole thing and let her rant to an empty chair. In the end, I decided I had to face this head on, even though I suspected it would be like walking into a courtroom where the judge, jury, and prosecutor were all the same person. Thursday evening arrived way too quickly, and I found myself walking into the community center. The room was packed, more people than I'd ever seen at an HOA meeting before. Bethany had set up a presentation area at the front with a laptop, a projector, and what looked like a stack of printed materials thick enough to choke a horse. She was wearing another one of her power blazers, this time in navy blue, and she had that look on her face that suggested she'd been rehearsing this performance for days. I took a seat toward the back, hoping to blend into the crowd, but pretty much everyone turned to stare at me when I walked in. Great. Nothing like being the main attraction at your own public humiliation. The atmosphere felt like a medieval witch trial, with me cast in the role of the accused witch. Bethany's presentation was, honestly, I have to give her credit for thoroughness. She spent 15 minutes walking through printed photos of my gate from every conceivable angle, complete with arrows pointing to various violations and community impacts. According to her slideshow, my gate was not only an aesthetic disaster, but also a safety hazard that could impede emergency vehicle access, a property value destroyer that threatened everyone's home equity, and apparently a symbol of my pattern of HOA defiance. That last part was news to me, since this was literally the first time I'd ever had any kind of dispute with the HOA. She even had data supposedly proving my gate ruined property values. I actually had to stop and stare at her after that one. The most surreal part was watching how she presented each of these supposed violations with complete seriousness, as if parking in my own driveway was somehow equivalent to committing a federal crime. She had charts, graphs, and even testimonials from anonymous neighbors expressing their deep concern about my pattern of non-compliance. I couldn't help but wonder where she'd found the time to create such an elaborate presentation, and whether she'd done similar hit jobs on the 3 families who had supposedly been forced to move. The whole thing felt like character assassination disguised as community engagement. When Bethany finally finished her presentation and opened the floor for discussion, the room went dead silent. You could hear a pin drop. Nobody wanted to make eye contact with me, and nobody seemed willing to challenge Bethany's version of events. Finally, one older man asked if anyone had verified the permit. No one responded. The guy looked around for support and found none, so he just kinda shrugged and stayed quiet for the rest of the meeting. I could see the exact moment when he decided that standing up for what's right wasn't worth the potential backlash. These weren't bad people, they were just scared people. Scared of Bethany, scared of confrontation, scared of being the next target if they spoke up. I'd lived in this community for 3 years, but I hadn't really connected with my neighbors beyond the occasional wave and small talk about the weather. Now, I was sitting in a room full of people who knew me by sight, but didn't know me well enough to stick their necks out for me. The atmosphere felt suffocating, like the whole room was holding its breath and waiting for me to just give up and apologize so everyone could go home and pretend this never happened. I started to understand how those 3 families might have felt before they decided to cut their losses and move away. Just when I was starting to feel completely hopeless and isolated, something happened that changed everything. The meeting room door opened, and Chief David Miller walked in wearing his uniform. The entire energy in the room shifted instantly. Conversations stopped mid-sentence, people sat up straighter in their chairs, and Bethany's confident smirk faltered for just a moment before she recovered her composure. "Chief Miller," she said with forced cheerfulness, "how nice of you to join us. We're just discussing a community matter that hopefully won't require police involvement." But I could tell she wasn't thrilled about his unexpected appearance. The carefully orchestrated nature of her presentation suggested that she hadn't planned for any wild cards, and Chief Miller was definitely not part of her script. I wasn't relieved yet, though. I'd seen how much support Bethany had in this room, and for all I knew, Miller was one of her allies coming to escort me out, or maybe to lend official weight to her demands. But something about his demeanor suggested otherwise. He didn't say much at first, just found a seat near the middle of the room, pulled out a small notebook, and started observing. He asked a few pointed questions about HOA procedures and legal authority, but he kept his tone completely neutral. When Bethany tried to explain the urgency of removing my gate, he asked to see the specific bylaw that was being violated. When she talked about community safety concerns, he asked for documentation of any actual safety incidents. When she mentioned property values, he asked if the HOA had conducted a formal property impact assessment. Each question was reasonable and professional, but they clearly weren't the softball inquiries Bethany had been expecting. I could see her getting more flustered as she realized that her usual tactics, emotional appeals, vague references to community standards, and implied threats, weren't going to work on someone who actually understood how regulations and enforcement were supposed to function. The meeting wrapped up without any clear resolution, which I think caught Bethany off guard. She'd obviously been expecting either my complete capitulation or overwhelming community support for her position. Instead, she got awkward silence and uncomfortable questions from a police chief who wasn't giving her the validation she wanted. As people filed out of the room, Chief Miller approached me and asked if I had a few minutes to talk privately. As I watched Chief Miller's poker face, I couldn't tell if he was there to rescue me or to help Bethany bury me for good. But whatever was about to happen, I had the feeling that this conversation would determine whether I was going to fight this battle alone or whether I might actually have someone on my side who understood how the law really worked. The parking lot conversation with Chief Miller left me more unsettled than reassured. He didn't take sides or make any promises, but he did ask a lot of detailed questions about my gate permits, property surveys, and HOA documentation. "Keep copies of everything," he told me before getting back in his patrol car. "And if anyone threatens you or your property, call me immediately." It wasn't exactly a ringing endorsement of my position, but it wasn't a warning to remove my gate either. I drove home that night feeling like I was missing some crucial piece of information about what was really going on. The way he'd questioned Bethany during the meeting suggested that he knew something about HOA law that she didn't, but he wasn't ready to share that information with me yet. Maybe I was reading too much into it, but I got the impression that this wasn't the first time he dealt with HOA overreach in our community. The next morning, I tried to post my side of the story on the HOA's online forum. I kept it factual and respectful, just a simple explanation of my gate permits and property boundaries with photos of the official documents to back up my claims. I figured that if people could see the actual paperwork, they'd understand that I wasn't some rogue homeowner trying to break the rules. The post took me about an hour to write, and I was careful to cite specific regulations and county ordinances to show that everything I'd done was completely legal. But when I checked the forum that afternoon, my post was gone. Vanished without warning, like it had never existed, not even a cached version. My account showed a message about being temporarily suspended for community guidelines violations. What guidelines violations? I'd been more polite than half the people who regularly posted on that forum. When I tried to log back in the next day, my account had been permanently deleted. At the same time, Bethany sent out a community-wide email about protecting our community from troublemakers and misinformation. She didn't mention me by name, but it was pretty clear who she was talking about. Some individuals have been spreading false information about HOA policies and procedures, she wrote. We encourage all residents to report any suspicious or disruptive behavior to the HOA board immediately. Apparently, in Bethany's world, due process was the real threat, since when was asking to see the actual bylaws considered suspicious behavior? But apparently, that's what passed for community leadership in Bethany's world. The fact that she could simply erase my voice from the community discussion while simultaneously painting me as a troublemaker showed just how much control she had over the information flow. But here's where things started to get interesting. Help came from places I never expected. Tuesday morning, I found an envelope in my mailbox with no return address and no postmark. Inside were printed copies of HOA financial records that I'd never seen before. Bank statements, expense reports, vendor payments. Stuff that should have been available to all HOA members but somehow never made it into our annual reports. A handwritten note was clipped to the top page. "I don't trust her anymore. Someone needs to do something." Whoever left it knew exactly what they were doing and what it could cost them. The numbers were, well, let's just say they raised a lot of questions. $50,000 allocated for community landscape improvements with no visible work completed anywhere in the neighborhood. And not a single new shrub to show for it. Multiple payments to construction companies that I'd never heard of and couldn't find in any business directories when I looked them up online. What really caught my attention was that Bethany's signature was on all these expense authorizations, but there was no evidence of board approval for any of the major expenditures. According to our HOA bylaws, any expense over $5,000 was supposed to require a vote by the full board. But these documents showed Bethany authorizing payments of $20,000 and $30,000 with just her signature. Either the bylaws weren't being followed, or there were board meetings happening that the rest of us didn't know about. Neither possibility was particularly comforting. I started to wonder how long this had been going on, and whether the three families who had supposedly been forced out had discovered similar irregularities before they left. Wednesday brought another unexpected delivery. I was checking my mail when Chief Miller's patrol car pulled into my driveway. He got out, looked around to make sure nobody was watching, and handed me a manila envelope. "I kept copies of the originals," he said quietly. "She doesn't know I still have these." The way he said it, quiet, careful, told me he knew just how dangerous this was. Inside the envelope were official documents that made my jaw drop. Building permits, survey maps, and inspection reports that directly contradicted everything Bethany had been telling me about HOA authority and community regulations. According to these documents, my gate was not only legal but had been specifically approved by the county with full knowledge of HOA boundaries and restrictions. Someone had been lying to me, and it wasn't the county permitting office. The documents also showed that Chief Miller had been quietly investigating HOA activities for months, keeping detailed records of complaints and irregularities. The really weird part happened Thursday evening when I was walking the property line behind my cabin, just trying to clear my head and think through everything that had been happening. That's when I spotted Bethany having what looked like a very intense conversation with a man in an expensive business suit next to a black SUV parked on the service road that ran behind our neighborhood. They were standing close together, speaking in low voices, and Bethany was handing him a thick folder of documents, all secretive and urgent. Whatever they were exchanging, it wasn't neighborhood business. I ducked behind a tree and watched until they finished their business and drove away in opposite directions. Who was that guy, and why were they meeting in secret instead of at Bethany's house or the community center? That night, I spread all the documents out on my kitchen table and tried to piece together what was really happening. The financial records showed money going out for projects that didn't exist. The official permits showed my gate was completely legal. The anonymous notes suggested other families had been forced out under similar circumstances, and now Bethany was having clandestine meetings with mysterious businessmen. Individually, the pieces looked odd. Together, they pointed to something deliberate and deeply corrupt. This wasn't just about my gate anymore, this was about something much bigger, and I was apparently standing in the way of it. I was starting to think that my gate dispute had accidentally uncovered some kind of larger scheme that Bethany desperately wanted to keep hidden. What would you do in my position? Keep your head down and hope it blows over? Or dig deeper into something that could completely backfire? Because honestly, I wasn't sure I wanted to know what I might find if I kept pulling on this thread. The evidence was piling up, but so was the risk. I was collecting evidence against Bethany, but I had this sinking feeling she was collecting something against me too, and I had no idea what her next move would be. But based on everything I'd seen so far, I was pretty sure it wasn't going to be pleasant. The breakthrough came from the most unlikely source. Someone calling themselves a former HOA board member contacted me through an anonymous email account. The message was short and to the point. Meet me at the old boat launch at sunset. I have something you need to see. Part of me knew it was reckless, but another part whispered, I might not get another chance. I'd been living in this weird limbo for weeks, getting hit with fake violations and mysterious threats while everyone around me pretended nothing unusual was happening. Maybe I should have just walked away and removed the gate. I don't know, but something about the whole situation felt so wrong that I couldn't let it go. The anonymous nature of the contact actually made it feel more legitimate. If someone was going to the trouble of hiding their identity, they probably had good reason to be scared. The person who met me at the boat launch was a woman in her 60s who introduced herself as Margaret, though I got the impression that might not be her real name. She looked nervous, constantly checking over her shoulder and speaking in hushed tones, like she was afraid someone might be listening. Her eyes kept scanning the tree line, like someone might step out of the dark. I served on the HOA board for 2 years before Bethany took over, she told me. I resigned when I realized what she was really planning. She wouldn't give me details about why she'd left, but she offered to show me something that would explain everything. We walked along the shoreline until we reached an area of cleared land behind my cabin that I'd never paid much attention to before. To be honest, I'd always assumed it was just county maintenance or something, but Margaret was insisting that I look more carefully at what was actually there. But when Margaret pointed out what I was actually looking at, my blood ran cold. The cleared area showed obvious signs of recent construction activity. Trees razored down in surgical rows, like someone had drafted a secret grid onto the forest. Concrete foundation markers partially installed in what looked like a grid pattern. Fresh tire tracks from construction equipment were still visible in the soft soil, and there were piles of building materials covered by weathered tarps scattered throughout the area. This has been going on for 6 months, Margaret explained. Always at night, always when most people are asleep or away from home. I felt like an idiot for not noticing it sooner, but the truth is, I usually approached my cabin from the front driveway and rarely walked around the back of my property. The scale of the work was impressive. Someone had been operating heavy machinery back here for months without anyone noticing. Margaret led me to one of the tarps and carefully pulled back a corner to reveal a weather-damaged folder that had been hidden underneath. Inside were documents that made everything click into place with terrifying clarity. Official-looking site survey maps showing detailed plans for residential development, architectural blueprints for something called Lakeview Estates, a luxury subdivision with 24 houses, complete with private docks and a clubhouse, building permits with Bethany's signature, authorizing construction phases, financial projections showing potential profits in the millions of dollars, And right there on the survey map, clear as day, was my property with a big red X marked over my gate and driveway. It wasn't subtle. The X practically screamed, "Remove this obstacle." The plans showed my gate sitting directly in the path of what was labeled as Main Access Road, Phase 1 construction. The truth hit me like a freight train. My gate wasn't violating any HOA rules or community standards. My gate was sitting directly in the path of the planned subdivision's main access road. Bethany wasn't trying to enforce legitimate community regulations. She was trying to remove the one obstacle that was blocking her illegal real estate development scheme. My gate wasn't violating anything. It was the only thing standing between Bethany and millions in dirty profit. All the fake violations, the public shaming, the threats and intimidation, it was all designed to force me out so she could bulldoze my property and build her luxury development. The irony was almost funny. I'd been so focused on defending my right to have a gate that I'd completely missed the fact that someone was planning to destroy my entire property to build a subdivision. "She's been doing this systematically," Margaret explained as we looked through more documents, targeting properties that don't fit her development plans, manufacturing violations, making life miserable until people give up and sell. I remembered that anonymous note about 3 families being forced to move away, and suddenly it all made sense. Those families hadn't left because of normal life changes. They'd been pushed out by Bethany's harassment campaign so she could acquire their properties for this subdivision scheme. The water utility expansion project she'd mentioned wasn't about community infrastructure. It was about bringing utilities to her new development. And all of it was happening without proper permits, environmental impact studies, or community approval. The scope of the fraud was breathtaking. This wasn't just HOA corruption. This was organized criminal activity. You know, I've heard stories like this before on channels like QA Stories. Corrupt officials, illegal developments, cover-ups that go on for years before anyone catches on. But I never imagined I'd be living through one myself, especially not in a quiet lakeside community where the biggest controversy was usually about whether to allow motorboats on the lake during nesting season. Standing there in the growing darkness, surrounded by evidence of Bethany's fraud, I realized that my simple gate dispute had accidentally exposed a multi-million-dollar conspiracy. No wonder she'd been so determined to get rid of me. I wasn't just a stubborn homeowner refusing to follow HOA rules. I was a witness to criminal activity who needed to be silenced before I could figure out what was really going on. Margaret helped me photograph all the documents before carefully returning them to their hiding spot. "She can't know that you've seen this," she warned me. "If she realizes how much you know, there's no telling what she might do." Her voice cracked, not with fear, but with long simmering guilt. As we walked back toward the boat launch, I asked her why she was taking such a risk to help me. "Because someone has to stop her," she said simply, "and you're the first person who's been brave enough to fight back instead of just giving up and moving away." The documents felt radioactive in my hands. Power, but also risk. I wasn't feeling particularly brave at that moment. Mostly I was feeling terrified about what I'd gotten myself into. The evidence was overwhelming, but so was the realization that Bethany had been planning this scheme for years and had already successfully removed anyone who got in her way. I had the evidence to expose everything, but staring at those documents, I realized Bethany wouldn't go down without a fight. Bethany had silenced 3 families. I just became the one she couldn't. After everything I'd discovered, I expected Bethany to back off or at least try a more subtle approach. Instead, she completely lost whatever self-control she'd been maintaining and decided to go nuclear. Friday morning, she showed up at my property with a cameraman in tow, a bored-looking kid with pro gear who clearly wanted to be anywhere else. "I'm documenting illegal obstruction of public HOA property for legal proceedings," Bethany announced loudly enough for half the neighborhood to hear. She was clearly beyond caring about maintaining her professional HOA president image. This was a woman who had completely abandoned any pretense of reasonableness. The cameraman kept trying to suggest that maybe they should approach this differently, but Bethany was having none of it. She was determined to create some kind of dramatic confrontation that would justify whatever action she was planning to take next. What happened next was like watching a slow magic car crash that you can't look away from. Bethany marched to my gate like she owned the world. She pulled out her brass master key, the same key she'd been waving around for weeks as a symbol of her authority, and dramatically inserted it into my lock while speaking directly to the camera. "This key opens every proper gate in our community," she declared. "What we're about to see will prove that Mr. Merritt has illegally modified HOA property. She turned the key with a flourish, expecting vindication. It didn't work. The look on her face when that key failed to turn was absolutely priceless. For a split second, she looked genuinely confused, like she couldn't understand why the universe wasn't cooperating with her plan. She tried again, this time with both force and desperation, and I could see the panic starting to creep into her expression. By the fourth try, she was practically attacking my gate with that key, and her carefully styled hair was starting to come undone. "This is impossible," she shouted at the cameraman, who had stopped filming and was backing away slowly. "Someone has tampered with this lock." The transformation was remarkable. In the span of about 30 seconds, she'd gone from confident authority figure to frantic conspiracy theorist. I actually started to feel a little sorry for the cameraman, who was clearly realizing that he'd signed up to document what he thought would be a routine property dispute and was instead witnessing someone's complete psychological breakdown. That's when Bethany completely snapped. She started shaking my gate with both hands, then hitting it with her fists while screaming about illegal locks and HOA property theft. The cameraman was trying to calm her down, but she was having none of it. "Keep filming," she screamed. "Document this criminal activity." But instead of documenting my supposed crimes, the camera was capturing Bethany's complete psychological breakdown in high definition. Neighbors started coming out of their houses to see what all the screaming was about, and several of them started recording with their phones. I actually felt a little sorry for her at that point. Watching someone fall apart that completely in public is never pleasant, even when they've been making your life miserable. The woman was clearly in the grip of some kind of manic episode, and it was painful to watch. In what I can only describe as a final act of desperation, Bethany pulled out her phone and called 911. "I need police immediately," she shouted into the phone while still hitting my gate. "Someone has illegally modified HOA property and is blocking public access. The resident may be hiding contraband or illegal items inside." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. She was actually trying to get me arrested for the crime of having a gate that her key couldn't open. The 911 operator must have been confused as hell, but Bethany was persistent. "This is an emergency. Send units now." The whole thing was so over the top that I started to wonder if this was some kind of elaborate performance, designed to create a legal pretext for searching my property. But no, this was genuine panic and desperation from someone who realized their carefully laid plans were falling apart. The police response was faster than I expected. Within minutes, I could hear sirens in the distance getting closer. 2 patrol cars arrived with lights flashing, and Chief Miller stepped out of the lead vehicle, along with another officer I didn't recognize. But then something happened that I'm pretty sure nobody was expecting. As the officers approached the scene of Bethany's very public meltdown, the second officer called out, "Ma'am, Chief Miller is already here. He's inside the house." Bethany stopped mid-rant and turned toward my cabin with a look of absolute confusion. That's when my front door opened and Chief Miller stepped onto my porch, holding a glass of iced tea. The expression on Bethany's face at that moment was like watching someone's entire worldview collapse in real time. The confident smirk melted into shocked confusion, which transformed into white-hot panic, which finally settled into a kind of green around the gills nausea. She literally stumbled backward away from my gate like she'd been physically struck. The cameraman took this opportunity to pack up his equipment and retreat to what I assumed he considered a safe distance. The neighbors who had been recording everything looked back and forth between Bethany and Chief Miller like they were watching the world's most bizarre tennis match. Have you ever experienced one of those perfect moments where everything just clicks into place, where you realize the universe has been setting up the ultimate comeback all along? Because that's exactly what this felt like. Chief Miller took a slow sip of his iced tea and nodded pleasantly to the assembled crowd. "Good morning, folks," he said in the most casual tone imaginable. "Beautiful day, isn't it?" I always thought iced tea was refreshing, but right then I felt like I was sipping ice-cold justice. Bethany gaped, speechless for the first time since I'd met her. The power dynamic had shifted so completely and so suddenly that she couldn't process what was happening. For weeks, she'd been the one with all the authority, the one making threats and issuing ultimatums. Now she was standing in my driveway looking like someone who'd just been caught doing something very, very wrong. But even watching Bethany's world crumble in real time, I knew the real reckoning was still coming. And honestly, part of me wasn't sure I was ready for what would happen next, because I knew Chief Miller was about to flip this whole thing on its head. What followed was the most surreal conversation I've ever been part of. Inside my living room with multiple police officers present and Chief Miller still casually sipping his iced tea, Bethany made one last desperate attempt to control the narrative. "Officers," she said, trying to regain her composure and professional demeanor, "this man has illegally seized HOA property. That gate blocks a public access road that the community needs for emergency services and utility maintenance." It was almost impressive how quickly she'd shifted from screaming lunatic back to concerned community leader. But the damage was already done. Everyone had seen her public breakdown, and Chief Miller's presence in my house clearly indicated that he wasn't buying her story. The other officer was taking notes while Chief Miller just sat there with that same neutral expression he'd worn at the HOA meeting, letting Bethany dig herself deeper with every word. Chief Miller set down his iced tea and pulled out his notebook, the same one he'd been using at the HOA meeting. "Ma'am," he said with his practiced calm, the kind that precedes bad news, "you know perfectly well this is private property. In fact, you personally signed the HOA budget 3 years ago to build the fence that clearly marks these property boundaries." He flipped through a few pages and continued, "I have also verified that Mr. Merritt obtained all proper permits for his gate installation, and the county has confirmed that no public access roads or utility easements crossed his property." Bethany's face went pale as she realized that Chief Miller had been conducting his own investigation this whole time. The careful documentation, the neutral questions at the meeting, the manila envelope full of permits, it had all been building up to this moment. That's when I decided it was time to present my evidence. I'd been carrying copies of everything in a folder, waiting for the right moment, and this seemed about as right as it was going to get. I laid out everything, the forged clauses, embezzled funds, site plans, fake permits, all of it. As I spread each piece across my coffee table methodically, I watched Bethany's face collapse, from smug to stunned. "Where did you get these?" she whispered, staring at the financial records like they might spontaneously combust. "These are confidential HOA documents." That's when Chief Miller stepped in again. "Actually, Mrs. Higgins, these are public records that should have been available to all HOA members. The fact that they weren't suggests a deliberate attempt to conceal financial irregularities." He picked up one of the bank statements and studied it carefully. "Care to explain why the HOA paid $50,000 to Lakeside Construction Solutions when no such company appears to be registered with the state?" The silence that followed was deafening. Bethany opened her mouth several times, but no words came out. She'd been caught red-handed with evidence that she couldn't explain away or dismiss as a misunderstanding. That's when the neighbors who had witnessed Bethany's meltdown started speaking up. Mrs. Patterson from across the street was the first to find her voice. "She threatened to fine us into bankruptcy if we ever questioned her decisions," she said quietly. "My family almost moved because of her constant harassment. We thought we were the only ones." One by one, people started sharing their stories of intimidation, fake violations, and threats that had kept them silent for months. "She told us that opposing her would result in serious consequences for our property values," added another neighbor. "It was like watching a dam burst." All the fear and frustration that Bethany had been using to control people came pouring out at once. Chief Miller listened to every story, taking careful notes and asking follow-up questions. Then he turned to Bethany with the full weight of law enforcement authority behind his words. "Bethany Higgins," he said formally, "you're under arrest for abuse of power, embezzlement of HOA funds, filing false police reports, attempted fraud, conspiracy to commit real estate fraud, and extortion." As he began reading her Miranda rights, Bethany's hands started trembling so badly that her famous master key fell to the floor with a metallic clatter that seemed to echo through the suddenly quiet room. It was the perfect symbol of corrupt power finally broken. The key that had supposedly opened every proper gate in the community couldn't even stay in the hands of the woman who had wielded it as a weapon against her neighbors. Watching her get handcuffed and placed in the police car didn't make me happy. It made me feel relief, like someone had finally closed a door that nobody had dared to touch before. The immediate aftermath moved quickly. The HOA board called an emergency meeting to remove Bethany and elect interim leadership. The county prosecutor opened a criminal investigation into the subdivision scheme, and multiple residents filed formal complaints about her previous harassment campaigns. By the end of the week, Bethany's entire house of cards had collapsed completely. The construction equipment disappeared from the land behind my cabin, the fake violation notices stopped appearing in mailboxes, and for the first time in months, the community actually felt like a community instead of a dictatorship. But the real satisfaction came from watching our neighborhood heal and rebuild. The new HOA leadership implemented transparent financial reporting and collaborative decision-making. All of Bethany's questionable fines and violations were reviewed and reversed. Community meetings became actual discussions instead of one-person dictatorships, and somehow, my gate became a neighborhood symbol of standing up to bullying and corruption. Kids would ride their bikes past it and point it out to their friends as the gate that stopped the bad lady. Looking back, this was never really about a wooden gate. It was about boundaries. Not just property lines, but the boundaries of what we'll accept from people in positions of power. Sometimes, a gate isn't just wood and metal. It's a boundary that saves a community. This neighborhood now has a chance to start fresh, with real transparency and accountability. And Bethany? Well, she's learning that some doors, once closed, don't open again, no matter what kind of key you think you have. If you've ever dealt with a power-hungry HOA president or any bully who thinks their authority makes them untouchable, you know exactly how satisfying this ending really is. What's your HOA horror story? And more importantly, what did you do about it? Because, trust me, this won't be the last time someone tries to use a fake master key on the wrong person's gate. So yeah, that's the story how a 4-foot gate and a woman with a brass key nearly unraveled an entire neighborhood. I still walk past that gate every day, and it always makes me smile a little. Not because it's fancy, but because it stood its ground when no one else could. Got your own HOA nightmare? Drop it in the comments. I know I'm not the only one who's had to stare down a clipboard warrior. If you enjoyed the chaos, give it a like, hit subscribe, and stick around. There's more where that came from on QA Stories, because out here, drama doesn't knock. It tries to unlock your gate.
That's a wrap from QA Stories. But don't go far. There's plenty more drama, twists, and unbelievable stories waiting for you on our channel.